This video is sponsored by STS Footwear. Footwear of the fans, by the fans, for the fans. Get your own Gator sneakers at stsfootwear.com and use the code GTFans for $15 off at checkout. Hi, I'm Jackie Franchuli for Gators Territory, here with a brand new On the Beat, and we welcome in Gainesville Sun's Graham Hall and Gator Bait's Kassidy Hill. Have some big news this week, and that's Feleipe Franks has decided to enter the transfer portal, and he's also exploring his NFL draft possibilities. But prior to the game against Florida State, Graham, you, me, and Will kind of talked about how that quarterback room was going to be interesting coming in next year. Well, now it's a little bit clearer now with Feleipe Franks gone. With Feleipe Franks leaving, how do you see things play out a little bit for next season with Kyle Trask, Emory Jones, and Anthony Richardson coming in?
Well, I think that it could get a little more murkier before it does get clearer. You know, first things first, I think you do need to give Feleipe Franks a little bit of props for being so quick and decisive to enter the transfer portal. With this new early signing period in late December, coaches really want some clarity as they hit the road recruiting right now. Florida kind of has a benefit that they don't have to really worry about preparation for the SEC championship game in that vein, where they can really spend this time recruiting and assessing their roster situation, which one that is going to have some turnover in the next few weeks here as guys enter the transfer portal, and Florida identifies some other areas of need that they need to hit in the early signing window. But you look at the quarterback situation, Kyle Trask, Emory Jones back in the fold. They'll lose Nick Sproles, and they'll lose Feleipe Franks. Signing Anthony Richardson may not be just enough for Florida. You never really want to just have three quarterbacks, and I know that that's something that Florida had last year, but it wasn't too far off that Florida was having three quarterbacks in a starting quarterback battle. So I think that Florida, just for depth purposes, will add another quarterback here, despite Feleipe Franks exploring his possibilities and possibly going to another school. I think that Florida could add either a graduate transfer or they could add a late quarterback here in the cycle just for a little bit of depth reasons. But right now you have to kind of see that when it comes to the starting quarterback job, it did get a little bit clearer between it being more of a Trask and Emory Jones battle than it looked like a few weeks ago, Jackie.
Yeah, and for sure, Dan Mullen isn't scared of using that two-quarterback system between Emory Jones and Kyle Trask, and I actually liked how he handled things against Florida State. We saw more of the scripted plays a couple of times of when Kyle Trask and Emory Jones kind of played together. There were some times where you noticed where he went with feeling rather than that script plays. But I think we're going to see more of that next year. I think we're going to see that two-quarterback system. Now, the only thing that we've talked about, Kassidy, is that next year's offense might be better for an Emory Jones type of quarterback because they're losing so many wide receivers, which made this year's team better for a Kyle Trask type of quarterback.
Right. And to what you said, I really did like how he used them versus Florida State. I think that was kind of some exploring as well. He knew he was going to have a little bit more wiggle room. He had the game in hand really from opening kickoff. And so he was able to kind of do some scripted plays versus some feel. And we saw, I would have to look at the numbers, but I feel like we saw Emory Jones more versus Florida State than we have pretty much any other team that wasn't an FCS team. And that's kind of setting up for the future. That puts that on tape for future defenses. And that also gives these two guys an idea of what they can come back to next year, because you never know what Emory Jones might be thinking now that Kyle Trask has said he's coming back for sure. Emory Jones might have been thinking as well, should I look at the transfer portal? But we saw throughout the year, but especially versus Florida State, Dan Mullen saying this is how we can use the two of you if you are both here. And I think that was part of why Dan Mullen did that, because as Graham said, props to Feleipe for his timing. He's also known for a couple of weeks that he was going to do this, and he waited until the regular season was over. He didn't want to distract anything from the team and the regular season they were having. And so because of that, I think Dan Mullen already knew as well. And so Florida State was an opportunity to really kind of get Emory in there with Kyle Trask and say this is what next year can be. And if that is what next year can be, then I think Florida is going to be set as far as their starting. I would almost think of Trask and Emory as 1A and 1B. And to that point, as Graham said, they do need to add another one, which they are now going to have time to do now that they do know that Feleipe will be gone. But I really liked how he used Emory versus Florida State. I think the flow that Emory came in with was one of the better flows they've had with the two-quarterback system, and gives us a good idea of what they can be next year.
Yeah, Feleipe Franks and the coaches met a few times about the decision of him entering the transfer portal or exploring the NFL draft. This is something that happened in 24 hours. And it was a mutual decision when they both kind of looked at what was best for Feleipe Franks. And so there was no bad blood in that departure. But it does make a question of who else might be leaving this team, because that's something that with the transfer portal the way it is right now, Florida is maybe going to lose a few guys in the next few weeks, maybe after the bowl game, even before the bowl game. They've already lost also Lucas Krull. He announced that he was going into the transfer portal. He entered the transfer portal on Monday, the same day that Franks went. Right now, Florida has 83 scholarship players on the roster. Once you take out the seniors and you add in the 2020 commits and Jordan Pouncey, the latest transfer. So they're only allowed to have 85 scholarship players on the roster, and currently they only have 21 commits. They want to bring in around 25 commits, and with their counters, they can bring up to 29 players. So I'm guessing they're going to probably get into the transfer portal themselves, which means there's going to have to be some attrition. When you look at that roster, I know what is the position that you feel like Florida really needs to focus in on when they're looking at the transfer portal?
Sorry.
She's going to safety. Let's start with you then, Kassidy. Yeah. Was it, when you're looking at transfer, is that where you feel like they need to kind of focus in on once they kind of work out those numbers?
Yes, for sure. Safety. And they need a couple more corners as well. Just the defensive back unit across the board. They need to add more numbers there. They needed more numbers this year. But because of some of the late departures, either between Chris Steele or then Huggins and guys like CJ McWilliams was hurt, although we knew for a while that was going to Randy. Yeah, exactly. Their DB numbers are really low, in my opinion, for what they need to be, especially in a defense like Todd Grantham, maybe in the NFL next year. But I think the defense has kind of built an identity over the past few defensive coordinators that it's going to stay the same. And to stay the same, you need more defensive backs. They need to roll more in there. They're not playing a true, like 5-man front or 3 linebackers. They need a lot of defensive backs that they can roll through there, and their numbers are way too low. They're probably going to lose a couple more to the draft. I mean, CJ Henderson is good but gone. He's a first-round. He's still a mock first-rounder. Marco Wilson could explore it. He could also come back. I wouldn't be surprised if – I'm not going to throw out names because I don't want to start rumors that are unfounded, but I'm thinking of at least 2 safeties that I wouldn't be surprised if they entered the transfer portal. And so they're going to need to add some more there.
Yeah, it's quite shocking when you look at the attrition at safety in particular. When you look at, for example, Randy Russell went into with medical hardship. You had John Huggins that left. You had Justin Watkins that left. And you look back and you just keep looking at all the stuff that happened at the safety position that kind of hampered them for the last 2 years.
Brian Edwards. I forgot. I knew there was another.
Yeah, Brian Edwards. There's been a lot of guys that have left from that DB room. So, Kassidy, you've talked about safety. You mentioned quarterback in the previous question. Do you feel like that's something that you want them to do? Because technically in the recruiting class right now, they're doing a really good job in the interior defensive line. But do you feel like they might want to explore maybe a guy like a grad transfer in that, or a grad transfer in the offensive line over ahead of a quarterback, or do you think the quarterback should be where their priorities are?
I think if you can go out there and get a guy like Jake Bentley, who is leaving South Carolina, would be a perfect fit, I think, for what he brings to the table, and not only Dan Mullen's offense, but that's a guy who I think would be willing to come back and be a backup quarterback with some starting experience. I think people don't realize that with Will Muschamp as his head coach, he was very, very close to breaking a lot of South Carolina passing records. So certainly someone that stands out as, if you can get them in your program, why not use a scholarship on them, because you can't just have 3 quarterbacks. But I think the other one, I'm more with Kassidy on the safeties. I think that obviously you look at safeties, I think that that's one clearly, if you can add a starting safety with experience, you have to go and do that if you're Dan Mullen. Defensive tackle, I think, is another one that we might have missed. Jalen Humphreys wasn't really able to play at all this year. He's Florida's lone signee at defense.
Played one game,
but the knee still was an issue. He's not in the best shape at all. Kyrie Campbell, Adam Schuler, TJ Slayton, those guys all may not be back next year. Elijah Conliffe missed the entire year. Who really knows what they do there? And they may, like you said, with the transfer portal, they may end up losing some defensive ends here. So certainly if you're Florida, you got to worry about that defensive line. I think that's a position that ultimately, if you're going to use some graduate transfers to bring anyone in, you have to do that. Fortunately, Brenton Cox will be eligible for Florida in spring, which will kind of soften the blow of losing guys like Grenard and Jabari Zuniga. But I think, like you said, the interior of the defensive line, I think you have to go out there and find a nose tackle and a defensive tackle. I wouldn't be surprised if they added 2 graduate transfers in that way, or guys that they think will be immediately eligible. But here's something I think we're not really talking about too much. I wonder how much coaches are going to be keen on using the transfer portal now that we've seen that the waiver system seems to be slowing down a little bit with guys getting immediately eligible. I think that you'll see more people tend to go in the direction of graduate transfers than maybe a guy like Brenton Cox who just leaves after his sophomore year, because it is more of a risk. As Dan Mullen has seen in his 2 years in Gainesville now, he's going to have to start weighing some risks, and you can't necessarily take some of the risks that he would have made in Starkville.
You're right, Graham. And, you know, Florida has benefited so much from the transfer portal. Look at Jonathan Grenard, a guy that came in and has done so much for this team in just one season, not just on the field, but off the field as well. He became that alpha dog persona that Dan Mullen really wanted on this defense. So I agree with both of you where I think safety is something where a position where they do need to add depth in that position, and I think they've started to do that in the recruiting class this season. And I agree with you that in the SEC you win in the trenches. So when you look at the depth inside and how Muschamp and McWing kind of recruited that position, they lack that class balance. Even if Kyrie Campbell does not enter the draft this year, or even TJ Slayton does not enter the draft this year, they have a gap between their class and Jalen Humphreys. There's no one in there for the entire defensive line. So I think they could even use a transfer portal, even if it's not a grad transfer, to kind of fill in the hole for next year, because that's something you got to look. The only problem
how they built that defensive line.
Exactly. They've been looking at it all.
Much of the talk last year was everyone saying, "Oh, offensive line." That's something, you know. In this time last year, we were saying we're gonna have to identify it. Well, what do they do right away? They go out and get John Grenard and then kind of stand pat. What Cassie just said, the year before it was Adam Schuler. Those two guys have been absolutely critical to locking down Florida's defensive line, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's one of the first positions that they address through the portal this year.
Yeah. You bring out the O-line. When you look at the O-line, they're so young, and you think maybe they'll even consider getting a grad transfer in the O-line, because that's something that they tried in the spring to bring in a grad transfer on the O-line. So that's also a position they might want to reinforce with the transfer portal. So I understand safety, understand quarterback, but I think that's the trenches where they're going to focus. I agree it's probably going to be D-line first, but I wouldn't be surprised if they went and they tried to find an offensive lineman as well, just to help with the numbers, because I look at that offensive line, and especially with how they struggled with the run game this year, and you see who they're going to lose next year, I think that's something where they realize we need to reinforce that so we have the numbers, because if there's an injury on that O-line, things can kind of get a little